Debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks the first time I rise in this House of Commons, and my first duty is to pay my sincere respects to constituents of Calgary Centre who gave me the privilege and responsibility of representing their concerns in this House. Calgary Centre is a diverse part of this country that represents the greatness that Canada offers. We're reflective of Canada's storied past, our present, and our hopeful future. The past is celebrated every summer as we gather for our annual Stampede, the greatest outdoor show on earth, the roots of which lie in the skills required of ranchers and the cowboys they employed to get their cattle to market. The present is a bustling metropolis that includes Calgary's oldest neighbourhoods, along with the new Canadians who have found a home here. The bustling downtown has been burdened these past 4 years with an exodus of talent and opportunities as a result of failed government policies, but you will not find a person who does not think our imposed difficulties cannot be overcome. The future is brightened as our new provincial government is seen to implement policies which will reverse years of economic stagnation with a growth-oriented, balanced approach to moving us forward. I chose to serve this riding because of all it represents: vitality and opportunity, diversity and history. And I'm honoured the voters of Calgary Centre heard my message loud and clear in this past election and returned a Conservative member of Parliament soundly over the incumbent member from the previous government. The message we sent could not be more clear. This government's policies are moving Canada in the wrong direction. Mr. Speaker, allow me to wind back the clock and discuss how we arrived here. Almost 2 years ago, on vacation with my wife, I broke the news to her that getting better government in Canada was a necessity, as I believe strongly we are impoverishing the next generation of Canadians with bad fiscal policy, false choices on energy, and overtaxation. I asked for her support in bringing this change to Canadians. She agreed, and let me say that without her constant love and support, I would not be here. Ruth, thank you, and I love you very much. It is no small undertaking to run for public office, but so many friends and supporters joined us along the way. And our message about the need for change in the way Canada is being governed resonated throughout our city. I owe so much to so many for their contribution to our efforts, and I will do my best to fulfill their trust. The message delivered by Calgarians so clear that the Prime Minister referred to it several times after the election. And the Deputy Prime Minister pledged to listen really hard to combat the disunion wrought by their government's agenda. In that context, I listened to the throne speech attentively. I didn't hear any indication of reversal or accommodation. I've reviewed it, and I find some relief in statements of potential, like reducing taxes for the middle class, like the government pursuing a responsible fiscal plan, like understanding that economic growth is the best way to ensure a good quality of life for Canadians, like better health care for Canadians and the ethical use of artificial intelligence, like getting Canadian resources to market and offering unwavering support to the hardworking men and women in Canada's natural resource sector. All ideas for our times. I also noted reference to the bedrock of our parliamentary system, which heartened me after years of federal powers drifting to various whims and interest groups. Perhaps there would be a change in approach. Well, Mr. Speaker, actions speak louder than words, and I am concerned, given the record of this government, that their definition of their objectives differ strongly from objective, tangible outcomes for Canadians. Will all these words have some meaning this time, or will they be empty virtues that show no results? Is the country being asked once again to play Charlie Brown to this government playing Lucy with a football? But there are clearly words and thus direction missing from this speech. No commitment to young Canadians who are now or soon to be entering the labour force, that their future taxes will not increasingly rise to meet the needs of the squandered finances of this government. No commitment to stem the transfer of wealth from working Canadians to international financial organizations for guarantees borne by Canadians. No commitment to right a regulatory system that has been broken beyond recognition by this government, giving Canadians a regime that makes national projects too risky to undertake, thereby further constraining and impoverishing a generation of Canadians. And this is especially true of Indigenous Canadians. No effort in mending the divisions created in the past 4 years. and during this past election by a Prime Minister openly campaigning against one region of the country. This betrays a true prejudice, and it is not becoming of a government leader. Mr. Speaker, I noted in the speech from the throne that the iteration of climate change 8 times. That is prominent, so I note the focus of this government's virtue. The climate is changing, we need to address it, and we need to address its effects. Let's also acknowledge that we are not an island, and accept that all our efforts would be for naught without efforts from significant contributors to the increase in greenhouse gases in the world. In that respect, let's examine clearly the cost of our virtuous approach versus the negligible contribution we provide to the outcome. Our world leadership on this file should be one that binds the country and actually helps solve the problem, not rip us apart with an approach that accomplishes next to nothing. This is our role to fulfill in this global problem. Let's lead Canadians to our solutions. But first, let's free ourselves of the bias and hyperbole that simply inflame reactions and stoke divisions. Our words and our approach matter. We have a problem to solve, and today's decision makers need to find the solutions that lead to our outcomes. But we need to understand that our use of language in this matter has led to a hysteria amongst a generation that believes the future is bleak. Au contraire, je crois que les
On the contrary, I think that Canada's best days are still ahead.
Professionals and technologists, parents all, who strive in their fields to make their lives in this country a better place for their children. All are dismayed by the half-truths and false choices this government is thrusting upon them. Follow the outcomes proposed, and on a full-cycle basis, they represent a worse outcome for the world, for Canada, for our environment, and for their families. We know there are no free environmental solutions to producing energy. Coal, oil, natural gas, hydro, solar, wind, nuclear, all have an environmental footprint, all have a CO2 footprint. Canada's oil production represents part of the best, most environmentally friendly 8% of the world's oil production. And let me add, that production in Canada to these standards is not inexpensive. Is this the resource we don't want the world to produce? Tous les gouvernements doivent faire.
Every government needs to pay attention to the solutions, or rather solutions that could lead to even worse problems. Yes, Canada needs to tackle climate change, and we can find those solutions.
Will lead to problems in addition to economic dislocation. Increased world poverty and decreased lifespans. Increased emissions from other more primitive power sources. Increased human dislocation and a threat to world peace. Mr. Speaker, let me get granular on Canada's world-renowned energy industry. Let's talk about the 175,000 workers who are no longer employed. Let's talk about the world-leading technologies and service providers that have been forced to work on competitive jurisdictions like the United States, a country that has more than doubled its oil production to 12 million barrels per day over the past decade, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1950s level. Let's talk about the reversal of fortune of our oil and gas companies, whose only drawback is their jurisdiction. Let's talk about the economic disadvantage that has been played upon Canadians by a non-constructive regulatory regime that has been manipulated by foreign lobbyists. Let's talk about the transfer of wealth of tens of millions of dollars per day from Canada to the United States, where our exported oil is uniquely bound. And from a Canadian taxpayer's perspective, let's talk about the taxes that are not being paid as a result of this wealth and jobs transfer. Taxes that would pay for schools and hospitals and doctors and teachers, yes, social outcomes for Canadians. And then let's collect our thoughts and let's find a way to rationally address the causes and effects of our changing climate. Let's look at solutions put forth by Canadian champions. The very definition of that is the companies in our energy industry. As an analogy, when you're in a tight game, you put your best players on the ice. Mr. Speaker, to address the effects of climate change, Canada's best players are in the energy industry. Oil sands operations have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 20 to 30% since 2000. Conventional oil and gas producers have brought their environmental footprint down substantially in the same period. And let's not forget that environmental solutions stretch beyond addressing climate change. Canada's energy sector is the best in the world at minimizing its environmental footprint. We have a role to play in the world, and climate change is a world issue. We will not begin to address its impact with a parochial approach. We have homegrown solutions developed here because of the Canadian public's insistence on building a clean oil and gas sector. We owe a great deal to Canadians of today. We owe significantly more to the future. And the course this government is leading will leave tomorrow's Canadians with fewer options and a debt legacy that will constrain their options in dealing with the problems that will emerge in their lifetimes. We need to do better. I urge this government to focus on real solutions that do not pit regions of this country against each other and do not divide Canadians by their status or where they live. Bring understanding to the breadth of Canadian solutions and show leadership to bind this whole country. There is much at stake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All done.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you very much, and I welcome the new member to the House and congratulate him on his victory and the obligations and the honour that carries. I listened to the speech with great interest, in particular because the member comes from Calgary, in a province which has decided now to lay off 6,000 public service workers, jobs that are maybe keeping some families afloat, especially if their partners have lost jobs in the energy sector. But in particular, what I'd like to ask the member about is the cuts to the homeless services. We know that Calgary is struggling. We know that Calgary has a significant homeless population, but as a city, it's made remarkable progress in comparison to others across the country. The $3.2 million cut to homelessness, I'm curious as to whether or not the member opposite supports this and supports making the most vulnerable people in that province carry the load when it comes to the cuts that the provincial government there is making, whether that's something which the member supports or whether that's something he thinks is going to build a stronger Calgary, but more importantly, help most vulnerable in that city.
Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question from the other side. 175 to 180,000 people have been laid off in Calgary, lost their jobs in the energy industry. Some of those find their way into homeless shelters. The policies of this government have driven those people out of work. The people of Calgary are not going to say, well, can the government come up with a solution here that they've driven us out of work? The policies are affecting the homeless situation in Calgary. We continue to deal with our homeless people as best we can. We also have a provincial budget we have to manage as well. We are doing the utmost given the situation that's been thrust upon us by a government whose policy is misdirected against this industry. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Saanich-Sooke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I too would like to welcome the member from Calgary to the House. And I would like to ask him about some parts of the throne speech he didn't really talk about. And two of those things are the need for a universal single-payer pharmacare system and what the throne speech described as willingness to look at dental care. So during the campaign, I ran into many people who were very concerned, especially seniors, about their inability to afford prescription drugs. And then one day out canvassing, I had a woman come out of her house to talk to me about the importance of dental care to her family, saying that her husband had had to spend $700 on dental work, which meant their kids wouldn't see the dentist for the next year. So the member from Calgary is a conservative. He comes from a province where the provincial government appears less than fully committed to the universal public health care system, has said it's not interested in a pharmacare system, and has said nothing about a dental care system. So I wonder if that member himself believes that we need a universal single-payer pharmacare system, and whether that member also believes that dental care is something that would help people in his riding.
Member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question on the other side of the House. The healthcare outcomes in Calgary and Alberta are less than they should be, but we do spend more per capita in Alberta in healthcare than we should. That is amongst the highest in Canada. So the results that we need to achieve from the amount we're spending in that portion of the provincial government's purview does need to improve, and the provincial government has recognized that. A lot of healthcare providers as well have recognized that changes are required in that system in order to get better outcomes, because in the end, it's about health outcomes. Likewise with pharmacare. Most people in Calgary, most people in Alberta, most people in Canada are covered by some kind of pharmacare system. We do need to find the people that are falling through the cracks and make sure they get the critical pharmacare solutions that they need. I don't think that requires a national pharmacare program, but we do need to find those people and give them a solution that does provide their health care needs for them. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question.
We have time for
We have time for just a brief question. I see the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. Brief question, please.
Mr. Speaker, and I would just like to ask my colleague about when he mentioned the tax situation, because in fact in our last mandate we cut taxes for 9 million Canadians, and now we're cutting taxes for 20 million Canadians. The only ones for whom taxes have gone up are those making over $200,000 a year. So I would ask my honourable colleague to clarify that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the request to clarify from the member on the other side. Taxes are, as this government can tell you, ins and outs along the way. There are many ways that the government actually collected more taxes from so many Canadians in the past 4 years, and there's some ways that they gave back to what they considered people that required it more than the people they took it from. It's the nature of the tax system is there's some payers and there's some payees. Many Canadians, beyond the 200,000 the member spoke about on the other side, have been paying more taxes over the last, primarily small business people, their families, people that have struggled to actually make ends meet, and more people have actually lost their jobs in my province under this government's mandate in the last several years. That leads to less people paying tax in my province than were paying tax before. That's a solution we need to come to very quickly, Mr. Speaker.